I ran upstairs, said to my wife, I'm going to abduct this woman. I'm going to chain her to the bottom of a pool, and then I'm going to slowly fill it with water as I film it and post it live on the internet.
All right, we're here with Stephen James, author of over 240 books. Now, what was it?
Not quite.
Okay, I'm sorry.
But I've sold 240 books over the last 30 years. That's about what it is. So, but yeah, I guess, I've done like 55
books
since I started doing this thing, 18 novels and then some nonfiction books over the years. So now that I think about it, that's a lot. Like,
it's a lot of books, man.
I never thought, like, when I started writing, I thought, maybe I'll write a book one day. Maybe I'll write a book.
Right.
And then you just, like, little by little, and all of a sudden you look back, you're like, holy cow, that's a lot of work.
It is.
That's a lot of books.
I've had that thought before too. I thought one time maybe I'd write a book one day.
Yeah.
I've written no books.
Yeah.
So
Well, maybe you will.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So, but you've written 55.
Yeah.
Ish.
Yeah.
55-ish books. Sorry. Either way, it's a lot of books. Okay. I did read you've sold over 1 million copies.
Yeah.
Over 1 million books.
Pile
sold.
everything up with the ebooks and the audiobooks and the foreign books rights and all that stuff. Yeah. Something like that. And so, I mean, it's kind of cool when you, basically, I write here in my office. And so, you're writing, you're just like, I hope someone's going to read this someday, and then once in a while, a fan letter will pour in, it's like one will pour in. You're just like, it's like,
my fan wrote me a letter.
My fan, I have a letter, so, and, so it's pretty cool. I love writing, and there's parts of it that are tricky and maybe not as much fun, like continually re-editing stuff or whatever it is. But in the end, you finish something and you spent like a year on it, and you're like, okay. And then you throw it out there and people will like it or don't like it or review it or, whatever, and ignore it. And you're just like, all right, it's time to start the next thing.
Just go on the next one.
With the next project, so.
Because it is what it is. You've written it, here it is. And you just kind of let people decide if they like it or don't like it. I mean, you can't control that part of the process. All you can control is what you write.
Publishers want you to some way, but like once the book's out there and someone doesn't like it and writes a bad review or gives you a 1-star or whatever it is, you're just like, what am I supposed to do with that? Like, it's out there. So I don't read any of those.
Okay.
Like some of my friends read every review they get, and but I can't deal with that mentally, because if it's a good review, you're like, well, yeah, of course.
Right. Yeah. It's a good book.
But if it's a bad review, you're just like, I'm like, oh, I suck. I'm terrible writer. I'm just like, wait a minute. No, some joker didn't like your book. So what? It makes no difference. But like, so yeah, I don't even try. I try not to look at any of that.
So like, this is my 55th book. I promise I know what I'm doing. Okay. I know what I'm doing. Not the guy that gives you the 1-star review because he didn't actually read the whole book. He just,
I was trying to think of some of the weirdest reviews I've ever gotten. Once in a while, I'll look up the 1-star reviews just to like share them at a conference or something. Be like, here are my favorite 1-star reviews. That one person said, I'm giving this a 1-star because the website won't let you give it a 0. I'm like, that's a pretty funny review.
That's pretty good.
And I was like, okay. Yeah. So it would have been a 0.
Yeah.
In that one.
I don't have anything out there where I don't think people can give me a review, like like stars or anything, but I get comments on social media videos and things like that, and direct messages from people sometimes that don't like. But the worst one I ever got was someone told me just to pass away. They said kindly pass away. That's all it said was kindly pass away. I thought, well, that's an awfully nice way to say it. A nice way to say it.
My first novel, The Pawn, back in the day, someone wrote to me, he didn't like it. He was a doctor and didn't like the medical sort of aspect of it, because they create this, maybe it was a virus or something anyway. It's this poison or something. But anyway, so he didn't like it. So he's like, I threw your book into my swimming pool and you owe me $10. And I was like, really? Okay, I'll send you it. But
here's a $10 check.
But the Harvard educated physician that I consulted with on the book ended up like replying to his review online. He's like, actually, here's how the virus would work. And he like explained it all to the guy. I was like, good for you, because it's like one of the things I really try to be as authentic as possible with the books.
Yeah.
That's why it takes me, literally a year to write a novel. Some of my friends will spin out books pretty quick.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of work for me. I really try to get the research right. It's been interesting because of like been to the Pentagon, toured the Pentagon a couple of times, the FBI Academy. That was pretty interesting.
Oh man.
Yeah, I went to the FBI Academy to do research, and they're like, "Who are you? You know, like, what are you doing here?" And I was like, "Oh, Stephen James, and I'm writing.
I'm a new recruit. What are you talking about?
You know, yeah." And they're like, "Oh, well, James Patterson sent his people here. Do you know who James Patterson is?" I'm like, "Yeah, I know. No, James Patterson is.
Heard of him?
Yeah. And then they're like, "Patricia Cornwell. She came here to research her books."
Yeah.
I'm like, "Yeah, no, I know who that is." And they're like, "Who are you again?" I'm like, "Michael Conley." They're like, "Oh no." I'm like, "Oh, come on, man. You're just like, you're killing me here." So, but yeah, and then the Pentagon, I get to go to one of the lower levels of the Pentagon. I was doing research for my newest books, and
that's cool.
And so it's very cool. You know,
what's the Pentagon like?
Interestingly enough, it's a boring building to be inside.
Really?
In fact, they move offices and stuff around almost to keep people confused.
Yeah.
Like, they kind of don't want people to know exactly where everything is happening. But one of the most interesting things about the inside of the Pentagon is if you go, so around the ring of the outside of the Pentagon is where the most, I guess, the highest ranking people would be because they get a window.
Right.
Okay, so there. Yeah. But if you look out one of the windows, they're like kind of yellow tinged like when you look out from inside the Pentagon.
Yeah.
And so that's because all of the windows are specially treated to keep out like different sorts of attacks, chemical attacks, biological, things like that.
Okay.
So,
wow.
So anyway, so it's interesting to note that in your book, like in Broker of Lies, my latest book, I mentioned that, like that if you're in the Pentagon, you look out, most people don't know that the windows is kind of yellow tinted from the inside. And so those are the kind of details I like to include. Not that it's a national security secret. I mean,
but it's interesting.
It's interesting.
Very interesting.
So,
like, people don't know things like that.
People don't know that. And even people who've been to the Pentagon are like, "Oh, actually, no, that's true." You know, like he did his research. And so like I love to include, if I can, those small details.
Yeah.
And that's why for me, research, I always want to get to the location. I want to go to where it is. You know, you can look stuff up online, that's fine. But to really get interesting stuff, you really got to be, I think, on the ground. And one of my Patrick Bowers novels, it takes place in New York City. And so in the book, Patrick Bowers is new to New York City. Now, I've never lived in New York City.
Yeah.
I've been there for different events, conferences, speaking, things like this.
Yeah.
But like, I've got to create this sense of authenticity for people who live in New York City to actually, So like he goes jogging one morning, and as he's jogging, like in New York City, there are no alleys.
There's no alleys.
Yeah. So like if you ever see a movie where they're like in a back alley in New York City, you know it's completely made up because there aren't no alleys.
Which I've been in New York several times. I never thought about that. There's no alleys.
So there's no alleys and there's no dumpsters. So there's no dumpsters. So what do they do with the garbage? They stick it on their curb out front in front of their business in their house or whatever. So anyway, so if you go jogging, running early enough in the morning, you'll see the garbage still out from the night before, where everyone stuck it out before it got picked up by the garbage people.
Okay.
Well, if you do that, sometimes you'll see the garbage bags move. And so, like in this book, Bowers is jogging along. He's running one morning. He sees this garbage bag moving. He's like, "What is that? Is it a baby or something?" He runs over, rips it open. Well, it's rats.
Right.
So there's so many rats in New York City that when you set the garbage out, they'll get into the garbage bags. If you go early enough, you'll see them moving.
Oh, it's the
rats
creepy.
inside. Yeah. So like that detail, like I can include that detail in my book. And people who live in New York City are like, "Yeah, actually,
that's exactly right.
That's right." But people who don't are like, "Dude, that's interesting."
Very cool.
Yeah. So every book, I'm always looking for those little kind of moments like that. With Broker of Lies, part of it takes place in Knoxville, actually, and in at the Y12 plant in Oak Ridge.
Yeah.
And so I did some research there, and took a sort of a little tour of part of Oak Ridge, and
the parts they would show you.
They would show me, But then, so there's this research area, and I'm like, well, that's not as high, like security. I could go there and literally, look around or do some research or whatever. So I drove up, and there's like two guys out front with like, machine guns or whatever, stand there.
Yeah.
I drove up, and I'm like, "Hey, like, what are you doing here?" Like, yeah, I'm just here to do some research.
I'm James Patterson.
Yeah, I know, right? They're like, research on what? I'm like, I'm writing a book. I'm like, they're like, let's see your driver's license. So I hand my driver's license. They go to the back. They like take a photograph of the back of my car, like the tag on my car license, and then they're like my driver's license. They're like, we're taking a photo of you. They're obviously they're not going to let me go in.
Right.
So like they're like, look at us. And so I look over. I'm like, do you smile? Like, I don't know.
Right.
So like I'm looking up. I'm like, yeah, like, am I supposed to smile? You're going to stick me on some watch list somewhere.
Right.
What kind of photo do you want? So yeah. So
you can't look like menacing or anything.
No,
you can't be like,
menacing,
Oh, he's up to bad
so
stuff.
I'm like half smiling in this photo. They take the photo and they make me turn around and leave. So, but in some government database somewhere is my goofy face.
Stephen James.
Yeah, Stephen James. When he was trying to get into this space. So sometimes you don't get, exactly what you want, but you get a story out of it. So there you go.
Absolutely. Now you're on the this podcast talking about
I know
that moment.
Yeah. So
like, do you feel like that kind of research though that you're doing that sets you apart in some ways? Like I would assume there's a lot of people out there that are you consider maybe lazy writers that kind of just relying on what they've seen or what they know without actually going to a place, researching it, like diving in and getting those details out that make the story come to life way better than if you just kind of, we're winging it over the course of a couple months.
I mean, I don't want to say I'm better or worse than people who do, a different approach, but I would say that it does, in a sense, create sort of more, I guess, authenticity or believability. I'm hoping one of the best, fan letters I ever got, the one that poured in,
fan,
the fan. But it was from this the guy that wrote, and he said, "I've been a detective for 17 years, and when I read your books, I feel like I'm at a crime scene again."
Wow.
To me, that is huge because it's like he's reading the book and he's like, okay, whatever. I think it was The Rook. You'd read The Rook or something, but he's like, yeah, I feel like I'm in a crime scene. So for me, that is what makes it worthwhile. Yeah. I want someone who is in the FBI or lives or works at the Pentagon or works in law enforcement to read my book and say, okay, yeah, I buy it.
This is legit.
It's legit. Obviously it's, a fictional story, but
yeah.
And so one of the guys that I consult with for my gun stuff, it was, he trained people at the Secret Service, SWAT teams for almost over 30 years. It's like he was the guy that they would go to. So I asked him one day, I was like, how many people have you actually trained in law enforcement to shoot?
Yeah.
And he's like, 30 years, 50,000.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So like he's the guy that trained 50,000 SWAT members, Secret Service members all throughout the country. And so it's like, when I have a question about guns, boom, I go to him. And so that's the kind of people that I like. So if you're reading it, you're like, okay, well, I maybe never knew that before, but that is legit.
But you're getting the highest qualified people in their field to give you a legitimate point of view or some real insight and research into what's going to make the story the most realistic.
I was writing one of my novels, The Queen, which has to do with kind of a Cold War conspiracy and some nuclear weapons, things like this. And so I was at an Air Force base in Texas. And I was meeting with a colonel there who worked in cybersecurity, stopping forward threats. So his team would stop like foreign threats trying to break into the Air Force, like 10,000 a week at the time. And this is a decade ago.
Okay.
Can you even imagine today, like how many threats they're trying to stop every day?
All the time.
Yeah, it's just crazy. So, but I said to him, I was like, well, in my book, I'm trying to get someone to remotely fire a nuclear missile from one of our submarines.
Okay.
He's like, oh, that's easy. And so
that's it. Yeah, we got
he tells me how
everywhere.
To do it. So he tells me how to do it. So I was like, all right, I'm doing it. So like in the book,
that's great.
That was pretty interesting. And then
I like that you go there with a scenario like, I want my characters to do this, and they're like, yeah, they can do that.
Yeah. There was one of my stories I had to do with a guy who's one of the world's greatest escape artists and magicians. So I went to Las Vegas and met with some of the designers for different effects for some of the big magicians.
Okay.
Or whatever, in there. And so like, again, I said to him, look, I want this character to have to escape from a tank of piranhas in a way no one's ever seen before. So like he helped me come up with something.
Really?
So it's pretty interesting.
That's pretty
Yeah,
cool.
and it was really interesting. And so yeah, it's fascinating that like a lot of people are really open to helping you out. If you just come like, look, I'm a poor writer, I'm trying to write a book. You know, it's like, but people have been very gracious over the years as far as like just giving me insights, and a lot of it is that they can trust me at this point because I'm like, look, I'm not here to make you look bad or whatever.
Right.
It's like I want it to be authentic.
Yeah.
And so, it's been super.
You don't have an agenda. You're not writing even a nonfiction book about a certain thing politically or anything like that. You're writing great stories. What was the first fiction book you ever wrote?
It was The Pawn.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that was the first. I did 11 books in that series with an FBI agent named Patrick Bowers.
Yeah.
But The Pawn was the first, and interestingly enough, I had this idea for this story. This is back in 2001. And I was like, I want to write a novel. Like, I think I could do a book, right? Like, I want to write a book.
I want to write a book.
And so, so I went to this conference with this guy who is a famous author. And he said, the first thing you have to do to write your novel is write a 40-page single-space outline of the story. And I was there and I was like, wow, look, I can't do that. I don't know how to do that. I don't want to do that. I'm not interested in that.
I don't want to do that.
It has nothing to do with anything. So I was like, I'm not going to. So for 4 years, like I didn't work on my book. Well, I had ideas, so I'd jot down, but eventually I was like, you know what? Screw it. Like literally, I want to write my story. I'm going to write my story. Like I'm not going to do this outline business. And so I wrote the first 50 pages of The Pawn and ended up getting a 3-book deal from that with one of the publishers I was working with. And so then I just kind of kept adding on different books in the series. But ever since then, I've really been trying to teach people like, look, you don't have to do this plot templates and formulas and all this kind of stuff. Tell a great story. You don't need to do those things. And it's just been fascinating to try and help people write, better stories.
Yeah. Well, you wrote a book about that, right?
Yeah,
called Story Over Structure?
Yeah, Story Trump Structure.
Story Trump Structure.
Yeah. So I did that book, and then I've done a couple of other writing books, but one of the things, my idea of what a story has changed over the last few years.
Okay.
So back in the 90s, I actually got a master's degree in storytelling, and we were talking about that earlier.
That's cool.
Then for about 25 years, I trained authors and storytellers around the world, different events and stuff like this. But over the last couple of years, sort of my perspective has changed a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah. And so,
how so?
So ever since Aristotle wrote this book, Poetics, thousands of years ago, people have been looking at story through like what I would call a temporal lens. In other words, like beginning, middle, end.
Right.
First act, second act, third act.
Yep.
Inciting incident, rising action, denouement, whatever.
Okay.
So, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that, except I feel like it gives people the impression that a story is about a series of events instead of a collision of desires.
Wow.
So so like I put this idea away, like, okay, I get it that a story has a beginning, middle, end. So does a bratwurst. Like, what does that help? How does that help me? It's like, instead, I started to say, like, what are the core elements to a great story? No matter how many acts it has. Let's say it doesn't have 3. It has 1, a 1-act play or 2-act play or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And so that kind of led me to this sort of perspective that obviously a story has a character and a setting.
Right.
But in my view, it also always has a struggle. Something goes wrong.
Yeah.
We were talking about this earlier. We both have 3 daughters.
Yeah.
When my kids were little, I would always tell them this continuing bedtime story.
Okay.
So like at the end of the night, I would build up to this exciting moment. I'd say, I'm going to tell you more tomorrow. They said, no, Daddy, tell us more tonight. I said, nope. Tell you more. I said, please, Daddy. I said, nope, tell you more tomorrow. So the next night I would like say, as you remember, and I would remind them what happened the night before. So it'd give me a chance to make something up for that night. So I'd make something up, get to an exciting moment. I'll tell you more tomorrow. So this goes on. Well, it started when my oldest daughter was 3 years old. Okay. I went to, she was about 15, at least 300 nights a year.
Wow.
So this story.
That makes me feel like a horrible dad, by the way.
That's my whole point. That's the exact, that's the whole point of the story.
Dad, will you read me a story? I'm too tired. I can't even come up with a story. I can't even read a story.
Yeah.
No,
so this story had, over 3,000 episodes.
Nice.
Yeah. And so
that's cool.
Interestingly enough, after like 2,000 episodes, I was like kind of tired of this. It was a fantastical world, like realm of sort of like Lord of the Rings or Chronicles of Narnia with animals and wizards and talking and dragons, the whole thing.
Amazing.
Yeah. So anyway, so about like after 2,000 episodes or so, I was like, I'm ready for a new story.
Yeah.
So one night I said to the kids, I built up to this exciting moment and I said, and they all lived happily ever after. My daughter, she's 5. She goes, no, they didn't. I said, yes, they did. Trust me. They lived happily ever after. She goes, no, they didn't, Daddy. Something went wrong. And even at 5 years old, she knew that for a story to go on, something had to go wrong.
Yeah.
So that's why I when I teach about story, I always say, like, look, what's the struggle? It isn't just what happens.
Yeah.
What goes wrong?
Yeah.
And so, and then the next thing I always think of is pursuit, that a character has to pursue something, not just have it happen to them.
Okay. So, there's something they want.
Yeah. So like you could have 3 events. I woke up this morning, had a cup of coffee. I came downstairs and wrote for a while. Oh, you've got 3 acts. Waking up, eating or drink coffee and coming out. That's a report, but it's not a story.
Yeah.
So there's no struggle. There's no pursuit. There's nothing like that. So anyway, those 4 I feel like are essential to any story.
Okay.
But then there's 2 more elements that I feel like are always present in all great stories.
Okay.
So one of them is what I call the pivot. So a pivot, it's a moment where something happens that's unexpected, yet also inevitable, both. Okay, so basically, when you have a story, like you have a bunch of stuff that happens because of what happens preceding it. Like, I'm hungry, so I go get something to eat, or whatever the cause of it. Well, if your story is just stuff that happens because of what precedes it, it's going to be pretty predictable and very boring.
Right, because you're going to see everything.
Because you're going to see it. You're going to know it. And you've read books, you've seen movies where that's why. You're watching, you're like, oh, come on, man. Seriously, come on.
Yeah.
We don't want a story to go in exactly the way that we anticipate.
Okay.
But we want it to make sense, though, too. Like, so that's why we want it to be unexpected, but yet inevitable, both. Where it totally makes sense when you get to that moment. Some people call it post-dictable. Like it's post-dictable, not predictable. But when you look back at the story, you're like, oh, that totally makes sense. Okay. So that's what I'm shooting for in every scene.
Okay.
Is to have a pivot. And then a pivot as a whole for the whole book. So I'm always looking for like a twist or a way to move the story forward. And then payoff. Like obviously at the end, does it work? Is it funny? Is it scary? Whatever. And so this is sort of this new perspective of story. I'm not focusing so much on when stuff happens or what happens and obviously things occur.
Yeah.
But I'm looking for moments where there's a surprise that still makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So that's been very interesting. And so as I write, I don't plot anything out. I don't outline anything. I write, and I always ask myself, these questions like, what would this character naturally do? And how can I make things worse?
Right.
And how can I add a pivot to the story? And interestingly enough, I was working on The Rook back in the day, and I was trying to think, what's the worst thing that I could think to happen to me? I thought, well, maybe if I was chained to the bottom of a pool, it's filling with water, and I know it's going to go up over my head, that would be terrifying.
That would be pretty bad.
So I had that idea, and I ran upstairs because I write in my basement often. I ran upstairs, said to my wife, I'm going to abduct this woman. I'm going to chain her to the bottom of a pool, and then I'm going to slowly fill it with water as I film it and post it live on the internet. She's like, is this for your book?
She's like, I've married a psychopath. Great.
So I'm like, it's bad when she has to ask if it's for the book. I'm like, yes, it's for my book. That's what I'm going to do in the book. So then
it's research. I'm just doing research.
It's like, why is the basement suddenly filled with water?
Right, what are you doing down there?
What's happening here? So the next year I'm like, well, what's worse than being, chained to the bottom of the pool? It's filling with water. I was working on my next book. I thought maybe being buried alive. That would be terrifying.
Yeah.
Next year, I thought, what's worse than being buried alive? I thought maybe being buried alive next to a dead body. That would be pretty horrifying. So I ran upstairs. I said, guess what I'm going to do? She's like, I don't even care. Go back to the basement. I'm like, all right. So.
Go back downstairs.
Next downstairs.
I don't want to know.
I don't want to. I literally
I'll read about
know.
it in the book.
Yeah. So I'm always trying to say, how can I make things worse? And then how can I add moments where, there's something unexpected that happens. And so when I teach writing, I'm always trying to get people to actually set their templates and formulas and whatever aside.
Yeah.
And not write plot-based stories, but pursuit-based stories.
Okay.
What does your character want? And what does that lead them to do?
Yeah.
And then how can you write those pivots into the stories?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of the screenplay books that I follow, The Nutshell Technique. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but he talks about the character has a setup want. This is something that they really want. That's why it's in the movie. They want something. And what happens is in the end, they get it, but it's not a good thing that they get it. Right. And so, which leads them to conflict.
It can be. I mean, I'm not familiar so much with his approach, but sometimes you do get what you want. Sometimes you don't get what you want, and we're happy for you.
Yeah.
Not getting it. Like, let's say that you really want fortune and fame, and that's all you want.
Yeah.
Well, we as viewers might be like, actually, you know what? Your family's more important than that.
Right.
So we're actually cheering for you to not get
that. Yeah.
what you're pursuing.
Yeah.
But in the end, maybe you don't get the fortune and fame or whatever, but you reconnect with your kids or something like that. Right. We're like, well, yeah, that's good. That's what we wanted for you. And so, it's just a very interesting sort of dynamic that's within stories, but I always think of it as unmet desire. Like your character always has unmet desire, which is going to affect their pursuit. Obviously, what choices they make. And, and so I was teaching actually a few years ago over in Switzerland, and this couple came up from France to go to the seminar. Okay, so I won't try to do a French accent for this lady. I'm not even going to pretend to do a French accent, but so I was talking about it. I was like, okay, so let's say that you have a teenage girl whose boyfriend breaks up with her.
Okay.
What does she do? Write the next scene. They're like, well, I don't know what to write. I said, well, you ask, what could go wrong? How can you make things worse? What would she do? And how can you have a twist or pivot?
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, what would she naturally do? And they said things like, I don't know how, there's 20 people in the seminar. This is the thing. Well, she would cry, maybe. Or she would eat ice cream. Okay.
Yeah.
Someone said she would go. Yes. Someone said she would go shopping for a little retail therapy. I'm like, okay, that's a thing.
So my wife would do.
I guess. Yeah. And then someone said she would go to gym and get a revenge body. I didn't know that was a thing, but I guess getting a revenge body is a thing. I'm like, okay, cool.
Nice.
And then finally someone said she'd call her friend. I'm like, oh, let's just use that. She calls her friend.
Okay.
So I said, all right, she calls her friend. What happens next? Write it. And so I said, ask the questions. Make things worse. What would she do? Believably.
Yeah.
And add a twist. So finally, we get a few minutes done, and I said, anybody want to share this woman from France? Raise her hand. I said, all right. What happened? She goes, well, she calls her friend, and she says, Tony just broke up with me. And her friend says, come on over, we'll talk. So she goes to her friend's house, and she sets her phone down, and her friend says, I'll get us something to drink. I'll be right back. Goes to the other room, and then the girl looks and sees this text come through on her friend's phone that says, I'll be right over. I did it. And she thinks, that's it. He broke up with me because he's seeing my best friend, right?
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, well, that's a twist, kind of a pivot, right? And so then I said, what happens? She goes, well, her friend comes back and she grabs a knife and stabs her friend in the stomach. I'm like, okay, well then.
That escalated quickly.
I know, she pulls it out. And her friend drops down. Her friend is writhing in blood. And she drags her friend into the bedroom and texts the boy back. I'm in the bedroom. Can't wait to see you. I'll be waiting when you get here. And then she goes into the bedroom and waits behind the door for the boy to come with the knife. I'm like, that is terrifying. I'm like, yes, you should write a horror story. And so I said, is that the end? She goes, that's not the end. So then the door opens, or the doorbell rings or whatever, it opens up, and it comes in, and it's not her boyfriend. It was someone else sent the text.
Oh,
I'm
nice.
like, okay, that's interesting. So, but
extra twist on top of the twist. Okay.
Yeah. So it's interesting. You'd have to build it up, make it believable that the girl is violent, has violent tendencies, maybe something with a knife, whatever. You could foreshadow. But what's fascinating to me is that this person who wrote this had no idea beforehand what she was going to write. She didn't have an outline. She didn't have a 40-page single-spaced outline.
Right.
All she had was a series of questions. And then those questions, you press them against this idea, and you end up with this interesting story. Now, it's first draft. I mean, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
So I asked the same question in North Carolina one time I was teaching, and this lady said, I've got an idea. I said, what's that? She said, her calls her friend and she says, Jake just broke up with me. And her friend says, don't even joke. He's been dead for a year. Like, that's interesting.
Whoa.
Like, is her friend messing with her? Is
Right.
she going crazy? Is it a ghost? Like, so all of those things come not from plotting something out,
Yeah.
but from diving into the moment and asking these questions.
Okay.
So anyway, so it's fun stuff. And so when I teach writing, I try to help people back up, step back. And if you want to follow certain acts and structures and stuff, that's fine. But like what I'm more interested in is actually the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the structures and things are there in place really to just help you to kind of keep you from wandering or to keep you from rambling. Is that kind of
They can be, it's like there are some art forms that are very specific, like you mentioned writing a screenplay or something, and they typically do follow a kind of a pretty tight formula and stuff like that. But my view is that the great stories are not dictated by that.
Yeah.
In other words, like your story is more important, right? So maybe you're writing something and you're like, okay, I'm not really sure what to write. Okay, you look at your ideas or something, that's fine. But I feel like anytime that you break the rules in the service of the story, it's better off.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier it takes you about a year to write a novel. Is that about right?
Yeah, I mean, with all the research, the writing, editing, proofreading, all this kind of stuff. So
can you walk us through the process?
Oh,
I
my
mean,
goodness.
in as briefly as possible, of course. But I mean, how do you summarize an entire year? But I mean, from concept to books on the shelf, what does that look like?
Sometimes I start with an opening line that I think is interesting. And that might be all I have. So I wrote a book called Synapse. And it's a sci-fi thriller, takes place 30 years in the future. And in Synapse, basically all I had was the opening line, "You do not hear your baby cry." And I was like, that's interesting and kind of chilling. And what is going on? Like immediately we'll want to read.
Yeah, I want to know, what does that mean?
What's
going on?
Is it the baby okay or
Right.
whatever? So,
Yeah.
so like that book began with a that sentence. That led to the whole book.
Yeah.
And then, more recently I had this idea for this book, Fatal Domain, that comes out here in April.
Yeah.
And that started, it was a follow-up to Broker of Lies. So it's 2 spy novels.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, I had written a lot of intrigue at the end of Broker of Lies.
Okay.
So I had like all these bad guys, and I just kept throwing in. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with the next book, but I just kept throwing in promises and intrigue. So then I'm working on this one. I'm like, I've got so many like balls in the air already. I'm like, how am I going to juggle these? And so like that book, I started with an idea of where things might go based on a moral dilemma, but I also had all of these other storylines that I needed to weave in to it. Right.
Okay.
So yeah. So when I was writing it, I was thinking, what if there was this group who wanted to basically had a good goal, but were going about it in the wrong way. That's the most interesting villains, I think, for me.
Yeah.
Where they have something where you're like, okay, that's kind of a good point. Like I get, but then you're like, oh, that was a bad idea to do.
But you have empathy for the villain.
Yeah, I like
bit.
that. Yeah. Yeah. So in this, there's this research that this pharmaceutical firm is doing to help people with dementia or Alzheimer's, things like this.
Okay.
And it'll also help normal people. Well, not normal. I mean, but anyway, people without dementia.
Right. Yeah. I did.
Yeah. So, but anyway, it'll help other people.
Yeah.
With their IQ, it'll raise your IQ.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So, but it's a drug that's really expensive. Only the rich will be able to afford it. And so basically they're thinking it's going to exacerbate the divide between the rich and the poor, rich countries, poor countries like this.
Okay.
So they're like, we want to steal the formula, post it online, make it available to anyone in the world for free. They're like, we'll help millions of people. We'll help stop dementia.
Right.
And we'll also help the poor to hopefully, increase their, and so our heroes have to stop them.
Wow, that's interesting.
It is interesting, right? Because you're like, well, they kind of have a good point.
Yeah.
Like we want to help people around the world.
Yeah.
Poor people or whatever, people who don't have as much.
Which book is this?
The Fatal Domain.
That's a Fatal Domain? Okay.
Yeah. And then, but
awesome.
then you're like, wait a minute, you can't just like steal from, So anyway, But it's a moral
It's tricky.
dilemma. That's what's
more
interesting.
dilemma. Yeah, you've got all kinds of moving parts and lines that could be crossed or not crossed. How do you navigate those waters? I mean, that's fun. I feel like, as an author, like you have control of that story. You get to kind of decide what happens and put all these pieces together.
Yeah, and so stories come in different ways. Like that's, sometimes it's just a line that's interesting. Sometimes it's characters or in this case, a dilemma that I thought was interesting. So that leads to the story. So then when I'm writing, I'll basically sort of ask, these questions. Who is this character? Like, you do not hear your baby cry. Like, who doesn't? And what has happened? And where will things go? So that's one thing. So as I write, I'm trying not to hold the story too tightly in my hands. Okay. Like it's fluid. I look at it as sort of fluid. Like until it's published, obviously. It's like, it's out there. That's right. It's like,
can't change it now.
It's pretty much out there. So, but as I'm writing, I might say, you know what? I think maybe go in a different direction or something.
Yeah.
And then I'll go back and change stuff, maybe delete things like that. So for me, as I move forward, I'm also keeping one eye in the rearview mirror, right?
Yeah.
So that I can see where I've been. I'm like, okay, I think this is the right direction. Maybe I'm not right. Maybe it changes as I write. And it always does in some way. And sometimes the change is dramatic. When I was writing The Night, I had this deadline in July. And then I got an extension till August, and then till September, and then October, and then November 10th. And they're like, we really need this November
Sounds like
10th.
Me in college, trying to get extensions all the time.
I know. Okay. So I was like, all right, no, I'll get it to you November 10th. No problem. So it's November 7th, and I'm like, I don't know how to end this book. Like, I can't figure out the climax. And so as I was flying out of Tri-Cities Airport here in Tennessee, I was flying up to Cincinnati, speak at a conference, and I was like, as I got in the airplane, I was like, I got to change who the killer is. Like,
that's a big change, right?
Yeah, because it's been, it's a 500-page book. I've been working on for a year, and I thought I knew the whole time who the killer was. But it's like, if I use that killer, people are gonna be like, "Come on, you just brought him out of nowhere," and I couldn't have guessed that. Or if I layer in more clues, they'll be able to guess right away. So,
okay.
Yeah. So I was like, in order to make it unexpected and inevitable, both. Yeah. I needed to change. So I get to Cincinnati. I'm at the Starbucks there, and I call my editor. I'm like, guess what? This book's going to be even better than we thought. She goes, oh, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. I said, I need to change who the killer is. And there's this long pause. And then the phone, I'm like, finally she goes, I trust you as long as it'll be a better book. But it took me another month to rewrite the book, add new characters, stuff like that. And then there's another book, The Queen, where I had this character, and I thought, I didn't know who it was. It's sort of the mastermind behind everything. Yeah. Valkyrie was the code name. Okay. Valkyrie. But I was like, I don't know who that is. And suddenly, as I was working on the book, I was about 2 weeks before it was going to go in. I was like, I got to figure out who Valkyrie is. And I had an idea. I was like, oh, yeah. If I can make this work, it'll be this huge twist. No one will see coming. And I'll be able to end the book in the last page in a way that you'll never expect.
That's awesome.
So that book, The Queen, has that kind of ending to it where you're like, what? That's Valkyrie? And then hopefully the last page. And with Broker of Lies. So one of the things, like with Broker of Lies, my goal was that the final reveal would be in the last paragraph.
Wow.
Of the book. So you read the story and everything makes sense. All of a sudden you get to the last paragraph. You're like, no way.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Hard.
Yeah.
But that's why it takes me so long, to like, I can't just throw out a book because I'm really conscious. I really, really want the story to be something where people read it and I feel like when we come to a story, like we want to be surprised.
Absolutely.
We want it to make sense clearly, right? We don't want just surprises that don't make any sense. But when we read it, we kind of say, how am I going to be surprised?
Yeah.
And if we're not, it's like, okay, whatever. That book's forgettable. But if we can have those moments, those pivots, people are like, I did not see that coming.
Yeah.
That's, to me,
that's what makes your books really good. Is that it's not predictable, but you said they're satisfying.
Yeah. Satisfying at the end, right?
It's there's satisfaction there for the viewer to kind of, and they're trying to guess the whole time as to what's going on.
Yeah.
And that's a tough line to walk, man, because as a viewer or as a reader of a story, you're guessing, you're trying to figure out like what's going on, and like you don't. you want to be right, but you also don't want to be right.
Exactly. You
know?
don't. Right. It's a weird thing. It's like this paradox. Like you want to be wrong, but satisfied. It's like, because if you can guess every beat, you know what I mean? Like everything, you're like, all right, I knew this was going. So it is a paradox a little bit, but it's a game that we're playing.
Yeah.
You know, and it's a game that readers want us as writers to win, in the sense that they want those little moments that surprise us.
Yeah.
So basically what I'll do is I'll work on a scene, print it out. I write standing up mostly, so I'll stand at my stand-up desk or music stand. I'll make changes all the while thinking about this, type those in, go back to it, cycle through each time, going a little bit further into the story, right?
Yeah.
So, and then I might say, okay, things are going to go in this direction. I need to make a change. So I can go make a change. You know, it's easy. Just go back to that page, change whatever you need to do, and move forward. So, so it's chipping away at the story for me, a little by little, as time goes on. And sometimes it may not take a year. Sometimes it may. It just depends on the length, complexity of the story. And the stories are sometimes pretty complex. Like one of my books, I had 16 point of view characters. That's a lot of point of view characters.
Seems like a lot, yeah.
Yeah, and some of my books are 600 pages, not all of them, but so they're very complex stories, and I don't think you could really plot it out before you write it because they're too complex. Right. So
that would be, you'd be like one of those detectives with the board with the strings and be like, I don't even know where I'm at. Yeah.
My wall.
Just gotta write it.
Yeah. A friend of mine calls that the wall of crazy. Whenever you ever see like a serial killer gets caught in a movie, and like you walk in their bedroom, you're like, oh, well, here's like the wall of crazy.
That makes sense now. Yeah.
So, no, it's an interesting journey writing, a book, and I love surprises. Whenever I see a movie, whenever I read a book, I love those moments. So for me, the idea of outlining a book beforehand and then saying, okay, I'm going to spend a year just filling in the blanks, that'd be rough. I couldn't do that.
That's not near as fun.
Not
as
me.
a writer.
Yeah.
Okay. Because it's not just about, all right, so there's a quote, and I don't remember who said it. They said, I don't love writing, but I love having written.
I've heard that.
Have you heard that before?
Yeah,
and I feel like that a little bit, in that I have a hard time enjoying the process of writing. And when I'm talking about writing versus you writing, it's like I can't even compare those two things, right? So, but me writing a couple screenplays I've written, obviously the writing I do on a regular basis, skits and whatnot. But I mean, I don't really love writing. I love the finished product. Do you feel that way, or do you really love the process of writing?
I would say I really do enjoy a lot of the process. Now, there's some moments and stuff where maybe not as much. Like, I really love when I'm working on a story, seeing where things might go.
Yeah.
And then I really love at the end, just like little touches to really kind of try to satisfy readers. But I don't really love some of the editing in the middle. It can be a slog, right? Because you're working for months and you're just like, I know it's going to take me a while to do it. So, I do. I mean, I actually do enjoy a lot of the process, I think.
That's good.
Yeah, I think it'd be hard if I didn't.
Yeah, because you have 55 books in, you'd be,
I feel like
that'd be a tough life.
What am I doing?
What am I doing with myself? How do you handle creative blocks? Writing blocks.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I've never had that happen.
Stop it. You never had a creative block where you just can't.
Because I have an idea, and then I ask those questions, and that'll lead me past it. So, I would say that there are times where I've been writing a book, and I'm like, I don't know what needs to happen right now.
Yeah.
And that might happen day after day for weeks on end, where I'm like, now, it doesn't mean I can't continue. So, for instance, there was one of my books, The Bishop, where this couple abducts this woman, takes her to a hotel, and Patrick Bowers, our hero, tracks them there, and then eventually rushes up the stairs, past this guy pulling luggage, down the stairs or whatever, and rushes past. And there's a chase scene, the back of the hotel, down to the basement, and I think he gets shot in the arm or shoulder or something. They escape. Anyway, so he goes back to find the woman. He can't find the woman. Like, where is she? She's not in the room they were in. They search the hotel. They can't find her anywhere. So as I'm writing, I'm like, yeah, where was she? I have no idea. So I just
I
keep
don't
writing.
know.
So I just keep going on with the story. But every day I came
That's
back to my
good.
computer. I'm like, where is that woman? Like, whatever happened to her? She's dead, maybe, or I don't know.
Yeah.
And so literally,
That's awesome.
probably for like a month, I continued writing the story. But every day I would say, whatever happened to that? Where was it? Because if she's just like in a predictable place,
Right.
it's easy.
Yeah.
So like I listed all of the predictable places she might be in the hotel, and I can't use any of them. It's too readers will be like, come on,
it's too easy.
It's too easy.
Yeah.
So I had to come up with something that no one would have anticipated. But when it comes, they'll say, oh,
okay.
so that's the bishop.
So it makes sense. That's that's awesome, man.
So that took me a month to come up with what happened to the woman.
A month just to come up with that
moment.
That thing
but
right
I kept going on with other parts of the story that I knew, would occur and stuff like that. So sometimes I'll write I look at stories a lot as promises and fulfillment. Like you make a promise, narrative promise, I'll call it.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'll write the scene where there's a promise, and then I'll write the scene where there's a fulfillment, even though it might be 300 or 400 pages separating them.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So for instance, let's say one character says to another, he's like, man, that is an amazing spear gun you have. The other guy's, yeah, this is the German engineered X6000. What? The X6000? I didn't even know they were past the X3000. He's like, yeah, this spear gun can shoot through a cement block wall. Okay, that's a promise. Okay, you're not saying someone will shoot the spear gun, but readers are thinking someone better shoot the spear gun.
right? Yeah.
So like, so as I'm write the spear gun scene, I might think, oh, I know what's, I have this idea that might happen, hundreds of pages later.
Yeah.
And I might write that scene while I'm thinking about the spear gun stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if we finally see the spear gun go through the
it'll
wall,
come back or something, something. And because, so I'll write the promise and the fulfillment scene, even though, like I said, there might be quite separated in the story.
Yeah.
And when I'll edit it when I get there and stuff.
Right.
But
okay.
Yeah, so
okay, that I kind of leads me to another question. So when I write, I have a hard time like just getting the words onto the page. Like I have friends that write whatever it is, whether it's a screenplay or whatever they're writing, and they just start writing. They just start going, and they're like, I can always go back and change it later.
Yeah.
Like it's not perfect, it's not really how I want it, but I just want to get it going. And I'm the opposite. Like I don't put words on a page until it's exactly the way that I want. So there's not a whole lot of there's less editing going on later because I may stare at a blank page for a week, but then when I write it, it's pretty much what it ends up being.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? What are your thoughts? Am I a nut job or like what, am I a weirdo?
Everyone's process is different. It's all good, but a lot of times the process of writing something allows you then to see things that maybe you hadn't been aware of earlier.
Yeah.
Like let's say you walk into a carpenter's shop and there's this beautiful cabinet that he made. Okay, amazing. And everywhere on the ground there's like sawdust and wood shavings and like that.
Yep.
So the sawdust and wood shavings are not evidence that he can't do his job well. They're evidence that he's just doing his job.
Yeah.
So it's the same with writing. I feel like if you write and you might have these ideas, these sentence fragments or whatever that you couldn't quite use, you stick them aside. It's not like you're not a good writer. It's just like you're going through the process. So you might discard a bunch of stuff that you come up with that you think is good, but maybe contextually just doesn't quite fit in this story.
Yeah.
So there's one bit that I've thought I wanted to use in a story and I've never been able to use yet. So I can use it right now and that'll be amazing. So
yes,
but this guy's with this woman that he likes.
It's like breaking news here on the Josh Mancuso Show.
Here it comes.
Okay.
But so she goes, there are 3 times never to say of course to a woman. He's like, oh, well, what are those? And she goes, well, number 1, if she says, do you think I'm pretty? You never say of course. You say, I think you are beautiful. I think you're the most beautiful person I've ever met.
Yeah.
Okay. He's like, well, what's number 2? She goes, if she says, do you love me? Never say, of course. You say, I love you so much. I can't imagine living without you. Okay. Well, what's number 3? She goes, if she says, does this dress make me look fat? You never say, of course not. It's not the dress's fault. Never say that. And so like, it was this thing. I thought, well, that's kind of fun. Like I want to use that in a book, but I've never been able to.
But you haven't found a place for it.
Yeah. So it's one of those like wood shavings on the ground. You're like, okay, maybe I can use that someday. I just did, so now I don't have to worry about it.
You used it here, so
just use it here.
if it ends up in a book that I've written, that I write one day, don't know where I got that from.
Where'd that idea? So I mean, you know, whatever process works best for you. But I do find that when I'm writing, like a lot of times the process of writing allows me then to see something in a new light. That's
good. Yeah.
I was at this hotel in Denver years ago, and I was walking down the hall at the hotel, and all of a sudden I look, and the exit sign to the stairwell is not above the door like you'd expect, but it's on the next to the floor, like on the wall, right next to the floor. I was like, that's weird. Like, why would they stick the exit sign down there? And I'm thinking, only someone like crawling along on the ground would need an exit sign down there. But I was like, oh, thinking if you're trying to get out of the hotel and there's smoke and it's a fire, how are you gonna? And you're crawling because you're below the smoke.
And the smoke is up.
How are you gonna see which door to go down if the exit sign's above the door? There's no way you'll ever see it. The only way you'll see it is if it's down by the floor.
It's pretty smart.
Yeah. So I'm thinking there's some sign hanging guy was like thinking, how do I get out of this hotel if there's a fire?
Right.
I'm crawling along. He's like, I'd never see it up there.
Yeah.
The only way to survive is put it down here. And so,
or he was lazy and didn't feel like climbing a ladder. He just put it down
the ladder.
He's scared of heights, so he's
in there,
just going down there.
But it made me think. I was like, you know what? Creativity is not seeing what no one else would see. It's seeing what anyone else would see if only they were looking from that perspective. So that really changed the way I look at creativity. So creativity, I always think like a lot of people think, well, for instance, sometimes I'd write in class, I'll say, okay, write a story.
Yeah.
I'll sit down. People are like, I don't know. 5 minutes later, I'm saying, what do you got? I got nothing, man. I don't know what to tell you. And so I'm like, all right. So in the next 5 minutes, I want you to write a story about a pickle that doesn't want to get eaten. 5 minutes later, everyone's got a story about a pickle that doesn't want to get eaten. Well, what's the difference? Like, could they have written that 10 minutes earlier? Sure, of course, they could have. But they sat there for 5 minutes and wrote nothing. Why?
Right.
Because the problem is not that we can't come up with enough good ideas. It's that we have far too many ideas. So I usually teach people like one of the secrets to creativity is to limit yourself. It sounds paradoxical. Like a lot of people are like, oh, well, that seems opposite because I thought you're supposed to brainstorm. Brainstorming is not the first step. It's second step. But first is to limit yourself. So you might, if you're writing, you might say, okay, look, I'm going to write a comedy sketch that, you know, is 4 minutes long and it has to do with, you know, high school students, you know, trying to navigate FIED class or phys ed or whatever they call it these days.
Yeah.
So, without getting embarrassed.
Yeah.
Or whatever. Whatever you come up with. And then you're like, all right, so 4 minutes, you know, and then you say, I'm going to spend 15 minutes on this, writing this, and we'll just see where it goes. Just spend 15 minutes and maybe you have something that you can use. Maybe you don't, but you think, oh, I can't really use the FIED, you know, thing so much. But what if, you know, it's them applying for their first job? Oh yeah, that could work. So then you pivot into that.
So you put yourself into some kind of limitations.
I do.
So that you can
then
better
you free
focus
yourself up. Yeah. Because then you come up with.
That makes sense. Because I think sometimes, I mean, a lot of people, I'm guilty of this, it's just kind of like, it's sort of analysis paralysis is the word I've heard, where you just kind of like, you keep thinking of things, like, I got a gazillion things I could do. I'm not sure what to do first. Yeah.
One way to kind of get past that is just to force yourself to come up with something on the spot. So let's do that right now.
Okay, here we go. I'm excited.
So we're going to make up a story.
Okay.
So you and I are going to make up a story like on the spot. And we're going to see if we can have some struggle in it, maybe some character settings, stuff like this. If we come up with some twists, fantastic. If not, that's fine.
Okay.
But so we need a setting. Where shall our story take place? Where's a good setting for us? So
the grocery store.
All right. This is at the grocery store. You're actually right.
Yeah.
And so...
All right, I'm 1 for 1.
You're 1 for 1. And so at this grocery store, we need a character now. So who should we tell our story about? So
I'd say Clarissa.
It is Clarissa. You're
Yeah.
2 for 2
Yeah,
so
good,
far.
perfect.
So yeah,
Yes.
so
I'm in.
Clarissa is there at the grocery store, and so basically, well, let's just make up a story. So like, I'll start it.
Okay.
I'll stop at after a sentence or two, and then you just pick it up, and we'll see what happens.
Okay.
I don't know.
All
so
right. Ready to go.
So yeah, so this happened last week, and so Clarissa walked into the grocery store, and she said, "I am here for one thing and one thing only. I want to buy a
box of Cheerios." And that box of Cheerios is her favorite meal. She loves to eat Cheerios every morning. And she was out. So she came to the grocery store to look for Cheerios. That's all she wanted. But
she couldn't get them because the lady behind the counter said, "We don't carry Cheerios. We only carry Fruit Loops." So she goes down the aisleway to look for the cereal just to make sure. And as she's walking down there, she sees something you would never expect to see in a grocery store at all. She looks down and she sees
a raccoon.
Yes.
A big, ugly, furry raccoon crawling under the boxes and crossing the aisle. And ironically, that raccoon has a mouthful of Cheerios, and she couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
But after that, she was shocked to see the raccoon. But what happened next, though? This is crazy. What happened?
It is crazy because we didn't mention this earlier, but she actually is a raccoon hunter.
Exactly.
And,
See?
And so when she saw the raccoon, she's like, absolutely, I know what I'm going to do. And so she pulls out this hunting knife. Mm-hmm. She usually goes hand to hand with the creatures that she fights, and she dives under to go look for this raccoon underneath. And but the raccoon turns around and spits out the Cheerios right in her face, which just makes her even more angry. And so she said something to the raccoon, like it wasn't something she was expecting to say. It blurted it out. And what did she say?
"How dare you?" is what she said to that raccoon, who didn't respond because it's an animal.
It is an animal.
But she yelled, "How dare you?" to that raccoon. It scurried away after that, after it had blown Cheerios all over her. Very rude raccoon.
It was.
She had one thing on her mind at this point that she was going to do now that this had happened, and so she went next and
to clean off her face from the raccoon spittle and also Cheerios. But when she got to the bathroom and she looked in the mirror, she saw something she did not expect.
Yeah,
she did.
She did. She saw that thing.
Yeah,
I can't believe she's in the mirror
either, because in the mirror is where she saw
the fact that she had Cheerios all over her body, like everywhere, like just covered in Cheerios. She thought they were just on her face, but they had gotten all over her. And I'm not sure.
Surprised because she didn't know the Cheerios could multiply that quickly.
Right.
And most people don't know, but like raccoon spit causes Cheerios to multiply
quickly,
very quickly.
Yeah. So she has a lot of Cheerios there.
And so there you go. So we could go on with our story, but you get the idea. It's like
it keeps going.
Yeah. I mean,
it gets weirder and weirder.
But it does get weird. But then you kind of like can go back and foreshadow if you had to and say like, oh, she was carrying a knife into the grocery store, and like, why is she carrying a knife? And so you can make it interesting. You could, make promises, or you could, say this story happens in another dimension, or whatever it is you need to do. But if you were making something up, you could say like, okay, look, does it have a pivot? Well, maybe not, but we can make some pivot up, into the story.
Where would you have gone with the mirror when she looked in the mirror and she saw what?
Oh,
where would you have gone with that?
Well,
I drew a blank and I was like, I couldn't think of anything good.
I mean, I was thinking that she saw someone standing behind her and she had to whip around with a knife and there was going to be a fight scene.
That's a much better story.
Some sort of fight scene with her, and we find out that she's real kick-ass.
Yeah.
But who knows? But
man, I couldn't think of anything good. That's awesome.
But raccoon spittle and Cheerios is something I probably wouldn't have come up with on my own. So
No, you definitely would not have come up with that on your own. It'll never make it into a book. Although I'd love to see something about Cheerios in one of your books in the future.
I made up a cereal. I think it was called Tutti Frutti. What was it called? Tutti Frutti Curly Dews.
Tutti Frutti Curly Dews.
Yeah. So I'm like, so sometimes I'll make stuff up and stick it in there. Sometimes I'll use stuff that's actually real. Like I do in Broker of Lies reference Dr. Enough. They drink some Dr. Enough as they're driving through Eastern Tennessee. Now, if you live in Tennessee, you might know there's this place, Johnson City, where they make Dr. Enough. It's the only place in the world they make,
Yep.
Dr. Enough. And so like, I was like, yeah, I'm going to throw that in there. And people know the area. They'll be like, if not, they'll be like, I want to buy some Dr. Enough.
Some Dr. Enough, yeah.
Right? So you have a sponsor now for your show.
That's right. You should be getting royalties from Dr. Enough right now from that.
Product placement. What? Why
Yeah,
didn't I think
absolutely.
of that earlier?
A couple more questions and we'll wrap it up. Okay, what's the most challenging thing you've had to overcome in your career as a writer, and how did you overcome it?
That's a good question. So I think one of the most challenging things for me is, since I spend so much time with my story as I'm writing it, editing it, researching it, stuff like that, is if I work with an editor who maybe is presumptuous or something, and they're like, well, I think you should change this or something. And I'm thinking 6 months ago, I had that idea and I discarded it because it doesn't fit contextually in the story or whatever it is.
Yes.
So like that is a challenge for me. Now I don't mind to work with someone who's going to help me notice things I've missed in my story or something like,
sure.
Oh, actually, yeah, she's left-handed in chapter 1. Now she's right-handed in chapter 15. It's like, what? Oh yeah, thanks. I didn't notice that.
Yeah, that's kind of work you want an editor to
that's
do. Not
helpful to me. Yes. Right. Or if something's super confusing or doesn't really make sense, I want to know that. But I don't want to work with someone who's going to try to tell me how to do my job. Yeah. Right. So that is something I've had to, I guess, overcome or at least try to manage. If I work with an editor, say like, look, here's kind of what's most helpful for me if you provide this sort of feedback. But I mean, other stuff, it's just going to frustrate me.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I could see that being the case.
There was a number of years ago, I had actually, I think 2 books coming out. So I was working with 2 different editors at the time. And one of them was just frustrating me.
Yeah.
So I was doing a lot of running at the time. There's this place near where I live called the Pinnacle Trail, which is like a 5-mile trail up a mountain. And so I was like, I'm going to run until I'm no longer frustrated with this editor. So like I ran to the top of the 5 miles up this mountain. And I was like, I'm still frustrated. So I ran down to the car and I was like, dang it, I'm still frustrated. So I ran back up to the top. This 15 miles.
Man.
I just ran. And so I get to the top and I'm like, I'm too tired to run down. And I get to the top and I'm literally like, I'm so tired. I just ran 15 miles, 10 miles up a mountain.
Up a mountain, man.
And I'm like, I can't make it down. So I call my wife. I'm like, actually, I'm on the top of the mountain.
I can't get down.
I'm too tired to run down. So I had to walk down. So that just made me more mad with the editors. Like, I had to walk 5 miles down. Now it's dark out. Right.
It's too late.
It's been a couple of hours I've been running and stuff like that. So
if I had to run 10 miles uphill out of frustration, it would end with here lies Josh Mancuso.
I know, right?
Died while running his frustration out up a mountain.
He's like, blame his editor. So,
it's the editor's fault. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you get people. I get people all the time like, you know what you should do.
Oh yeah.
I'm like, oh, please tell me what I should do. You should make a video about it. I never thought of that. Thanks for telling me. Now, people mean well. People mean well. 100%.
People will write and they'll be like, I know a great idea for a story. I'm like, well, I don't want to hear it because I'm not going to take someone else's idea and write. Yeah. It's like, it's not my job.
If you have an idea for a story, write it.
Write it. Yeah. So
one of my last questions is, what advice, I'm sure this is a question you get a lot. What advice do you have for writers, for young writers, or not young necessarily in age, but young in writing, experience, who think, I think I'm a pretty good writer and I love to write stories. I think, you wrote your first book, which just turned into a lot more books. Yeah. And there's plenty of people out there who probably could be just like that. And some may write one book and that's it. But point being, what would you say to them to get going?
Just a couple of things come to mind. Like number one is burn your outline.
Burn your outline.
Yeah. Like throw it away and follow the pursuit of the character through the story. Okay. Like where's this character? So you're going to ask not what should happen, but what's character want.
Yeah.
You're not going to ask how should I end the story, but you're going to ask what in this moment, matters to the character and then follow them through. Ask those questions. So, I would say that's one thing. Second thing is don't fall in love with your first draft. Like, and you write it and you're like, this is amazing. I'll publish this guy. Maybe not. Maybe you should look at it, a couple hours later, the next day or something and sort of reevaluate if it really does work. And And I guess the last thing is rage against mediocrity. I remember when I was going to write my first book, my first novel actually was reading this other book that everyone's talking about. I got to the end. I was so angry. I like threw it against the wall. I was like, if that's the best that's out there, I can do better than that. And so I hear this little voice inside me say, oh yeah, prove it. I was like, oh crap, now I got to prove it. So that led me to write my first novel. But what I find so often is people are satisfied with mediocrity.
Yeah.
So I like really want to tell people, take the extra time, literally.
Yeah.
Work on it and make your story great. Make it.
Yeah.
Why not be brilliant?
That's good.
You don't know if it's.
You have a sign over here that says that in your office.
I do in my office.
I noticed that.
Like, you just don't know if it's going to be your last story you ever write or your one story or whatever. So make it.
Yeah.
Make it worthy.
Yeah.
So that. Yeah.
Why not be brilliant?
Yeah. Why not be brilliant?
Why not be brilliant?
Yeah. Someone's going to be.
That's awesome.
Why not you?
All right. That's a good way to end it.
Appreciate the chance to be on your show, and
yeah, man,
thanks for having me. Yeah.
Thanks for letting us come and invade your space, your house, your office. It's awesome here. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening to the Josh Mancuso Show. This is episode 3. Author Stephen James. You can find him at stephenjames.com.
.net.
That's what I meant. You can find him at stephenjames.net. A lot of books there. Go buy some, read them. You won't be sorry. Thanks.